It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic of my talk today, it's all about currency, but specifically the title is Control Your Currency, Determine Your Destiny. Now, I'm going to be talking briefly about myself for a couple of minutes. Then I've got 3 sections of 5 minutes to talk about the past, present, and future of money in Guernsey. Now, I was once called a financial hippie by a journalist, which I actually quite like. I just wish I had the hair to go with it. That's the only downside. But although I've had my background in investment management for sort of 20-plus years, the real achievement of the last decade was writing this book before the crash, as Mark said, called The Final Crash. It gives it away in the title with the big red arrow going down. And it laid out the cause, effect, and consequence of the debt bubble. And I said the crash was going to kick in 2008. And initially, literally in the last week of writing the book, I thought, it's all going to be doom and gloom. There's nothing we can do. But bizarrely enough, I came across an American website of all things which talked about the Guernsey experiment. And the last speaker talked about experimentation. So I had a route round and thought, what is this all about? And what happened, and this is the past section of my talk, is that 200 years ago, Guernsey was in a right state. We'd just been through 20 years of war with our friend Napoleon Bonaparte. And so all the money that should have been spent on infrastructure went on fortresses and war-related activities. So our sea defences were crumbling, our roads were impassable, we had very poor schools and very few public buildings. But what makes it worse is because we had our own debt trap at the time. And it was so bad that we spent 80% of our tax revenue on interest. Forget about paying back debt, it was just on interest. So effectively, the government was taking in money and giving it straight out. And the whole island was beginning to totter. And it got so bad that we faced being depopulated altogether. And if you ever want to see that in action, just pop over to Alderney and see how quiet it is. And that's just what we were heading for at the time. So the government, or states as they're called over here, decided, okay, we're not going to play this game anymore. And so they very cleverly said, we're going to create our own money. We're not going to charge ourselves interest. We don't need to do that. And so they came up with the idea of printing money. And you think, well, that's just inflationary. But actually what they did, and I've got some examples here, they said, okay, rather than say payable on demand and keep printing and printing, we're going to give the notes a maturity date. So all of a sudden they could create money, do something useful, and then take it back out the system. So the money supply expanded, went back to neutral again and again. And what we were left with was building after building. So if you pop down into town to the market, you'll see above the shop New Look the date 1822 and a list of committee members. I think, well, it's not a big deal. But one of the founders, Daniel Brock, was an inspirational figure. He was the one who came up with the idea that Guernsey, as a government, can create its own money. It was fantastic. So building after building was created. It wasn't just vanity projects. These are things that could create a rental return. So use money in its purest form, get stuff done, and get paid back over time. So debt, rather than snowballing through interest, was destroyed by rent, paying it down over many years. And we have both our ports and harbours were built out of granite from government-created money with no interest. So it's a huge period of success in the Victorian times. And you'd think, hey, everyone would be pretty happy with this, and got great infrastructure and a superb place to live. But no, this wasn't the case. Obviously, local banks had been cut out of the equation. They couldn't charge the government interest anymore. So, of course, like today, they went to the UK and lobbied the Privy Council, who said we could only create a certain number of notes. So just like now, financial institutions have a huge impact on government policy. If you don't believe me, just check out the donations page for the parties now. Okay, so that was the past. We had a great run doing that. What about the present? Well, okay, so why are we tied to sterling? We're next to France. And it all goes back really to the end of the First World War. We used to be much closer to France. Financially, we always had French-related currencies. Previously, it was the double, whose origin stemmed from the denier in France. And that, in turn, went back to the denarius in Roman times. So you've got this D effectively in common with currencies over time. But coming into the First World War, the French had devalued badly, and so we linked up to sterling through the 1921 Currency Union Act. So this is fine. We did pretty well and kept going even after the war. But we're now in this phase where we're lacking money. It's the same old one-dimensional argument. Do you borrow and pay interest, or do you go for tax hikes and austerity? It's the same old argument across the world. But there's another way. There is a choice. And the best way to create money is to be a bank. Banks have a license to print money. Now, the great thing about the crash is that this whole process of creating money from nothing has been revealed. And this is why I love the word apocalypse. It's actually a Greek word that means unveiling or revelation. We can now see the financial system for what it is. Now, I'm not here to bash bankers. That's not the point of TED. It's not a them and us. It's to highlight a lousy financial system which can be beaten and bettered. Now, by being your own bank, you can create money, get jobs done, and if you're a steward, you use it properly, you can use the money to create infrastructure, and boy, do we need some infrastructure now. And so I think we can go back to that approach. There's also another aspect as well. Because Guernsey is linked to the pound, we've actually been devalued by Britain, just like we were by France in the First World War. Now we've got a case where the British government have printed 400 billion of pounds to bail out the banking system, and we've been completely sidewhacked by this. The pound has devalued by 25% since the crash. So that's fine for the UK. They've got massive debts. They want to whittle away their currency and get rid of their debt. We've got savings, so we're like a pensioner being destroyed by inflation. So what we really need to do is, again, just print our own money. We can do it. We literally have Guernsey pounds in our pockets, and we can create that again. So if you compare the ratio of the population of the UK to Guernsey, it's about 1,000 to 1. So if we print money in the same way Britain has, we'd have a budget of £400 million. I'm not suggesting we go out and just knock out all these notes from day one, but we do have an opportunity to create our currency for local projects, use local labour and materials to get stuff done. And you can name, any of us can ratchet off a whole load of projects. But what we need to do with that money is have rent or returns coming back to pay off that debt in future. So it's not a vanity thing. It's there to create long-term infrastructure for a benefit for the island. And I can think of several examples. We need to be energy efficient. Again, all technology is about exponential activity, and solar ticks a lot of boxes. We have nice big reservoirs that no one can even see, which would be very nicely covered with solar panels. Don't forget about agriculture. We have lots of land. You fly over. I went to Alderney the other day, and there are masses of greenhouses collapsing around the place, full of weeds and falling apart. And we are desperate to get our own self-sufficiency in food. Again, by attaching exponential technology with a limited land mass, we can achieve a great deal of self-sufficiency. One of our deputies mentioned a local university, and he got quite a hard time for that, but I love the idea. Rather than just copying other jurisdictions or countries with medicine, law, the usual stuff, we can have our own specialist university courses to tackle these megatrends of this century on climate change, energy, pollution. I'd love to have those specializations here. But it's not just doing new stuff. It's about combining it with the old as well. Guernsey is a home to a very large private equity industry, and we can use that expertise to funnel capital from overseas as well as our own to develop these vitally important areas for ourselves. So what about the future? Well, I was in a panel discussion in London for the last couple of days, and we had a very sort of aggressive American TV presenter called Max Kaiser, who's quite a character. And I was discussing the use of gold and Bitcoin. Now, for those of you who don't know about Bitcoin, it's a completely decentralized currency that is owned by the whole network. So again, it's a bit like the internet of money, and I've got some on my phone here, which I can send free of charge anywhere across the world. And the beauty of Bitcoin is that it frees it from charges and excess control. By excess control, that could be a very aggressive form. Let's say if I'm sat in Cyprus, we mentioned earlier, let's say somebody decides that we're going to be subject to financial exchange controls or or sanctions. How do we get our money out? Bitcoin is the perfect electronic way to move money around in times of turmoil. I also own gold, love gold. Maybe I can't move it over borders. Maybe I'm not able to physically. As long as I can get out of the island, let's say we had God forbid, another war, then at least we could have an asset in digital form that you can use anywhere. So you can get away, you can start again. So I love the Bitcoin. I'm also a founder member, and again, this is a surprise being a bit of an IT idiot, but I'm a founder member of the UK's Digital Currency Alliance. So it's not just about Bitcoin, it's about all electronic currencies that are sprouting up all over the place. And I think one day we can even look at having our own Guernsey currency, and I've even thought of a name for it. Now, going back to the past, we used to have doubles or doubles with English pronunciation, so I'd call it the digital double. And what sort of precedent do you have for this? Because otherwise it's just pie-in-the-sky talk. Well, we heard earlier about Iceland being blown apart by the financial crisis. Now, rather than playing the game and going into this huge deflationary program of austerity and paying back debt over a very long time, they defaulted, said, we're not playing this game anymore. We're sending these senior bankers to jail, and we're going to start again. So they have created their own electronic cryptocurrency called Aurora Coin. And rather than just being a government-controlled thing, they've actually democratized money, and they've given the whole population a share of the new currency. It's like a national dividend. So money isn't being concentrated in the hands of a few, it's being spread around from the very start. That's very powerful. So we can keep using the old legacy currencies like sterling and dollars for international trade and for the finance industry, so it can keep going. But we can still use our own created money for our own projects. It's no one else's business. We've even asked one of the law officers, can we create our own currency? It's like, actually, yes, we can. There's nothing to stop you. So it's not about breaking rules. It's just doing stuff that isn't covered in the legislation. Okay, so I just want to go back again to something I mentioned earlier about the history of money. And it's one of the Rothschild family, the great sort of banking dynasty that formed over 200 years ago. And one of their Mayor Amschel Rothschild, came up with a great quote. He said, "Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who writes the law." What that means is, if you control the money supply, which banks do, then you control the whole system. Everything stems from control of money, and banks realize this. Again, this isn't about bashing banks, it's about giving control back to the population, the government, and the people, because 97% of money is created by banks. That's not a big issue, but when you stick an interest rate on it, that debt grows and grows, and money and power concentrate in a very small proportion of the population. And again, I'm not some sort of flag-waving communist. Yeah, I'm from that background, but this huge wealth disparity that's growing is bad for everybody, including the very wealthy. Now, in my introduction piece to this talk, I was talking about H.G. Wells, and again, the last speaker alluded to knowledge. Now, H.G. Wells was a great one for looking ahead into the future, and his view was that if you have knowledge that is shared and is democratized, then this is the future of freedom. And he envisaged this, he had this idea that there one day would be a world library where everyone could access knowledge. He had no idea about the internet, but in principle, that's exactly what we have now. We have knowledge available to everybody. Again, entrepreneurs can connect the dots and make things happen with great new ideas. But H.G. Wells also wrote a book called The Time Machine, and you probably saw the film, the 1960 version is the one I remember best of all from my childhood. And you have this time traveler going back into the past and also looking at the future as well. And this is actually how I wrote the book, by looking at past experiences, trying to role-play what may happen. Because if you role-play and get it right, you know exactly how to act in the circumstance. So there's one point in the 1960 film where what's happened is the human population is split into two camps. One lot are very beautiful humans who are fed and clothed by, they don't even question how they get the clothes and food. It's left out for them the night before. And they go living their life almost like cattle in the field, just lovely, munch away, go to bed. But actually what's happening is that they're being controlled by the mutant humans called Morlocks. And they are effectively man-eaters. They've mutated and become aggressive farmers of human beings. So the population is split into these two groups. So the time traveler, called George, goes into the future, and he's trying to teach these people, these human cattle, to fight back. And there's a lovely point in the film where he's fighting off these Morlocks. He's about to be overpowered. And one of these dumb human cattle goes, he works out what's going on. He works out they're being controlled and being used as fodder. And you see a moment in the film where he picks up a rock and he fights back. It's a lovely scene. I'm not saying to go out and bash bankers in the head. That's not very nice. And I'd be a hypocrite because that's my background. But what we can do is learn how to master money and democratise it. And this is the way we can use the internet and digital currencies to regain control of the financial system away from a small elite to all of us. All of us can have digital currency in future. So to revert to the title of the talk, it was this. I said, control your currency and master your destiny. And that's going to be my intention for Guernsey in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.